We seem to be entering a new reality, where the prospects of a direct NATO-Russia confrontation are here. And so when NATO's most senior military officer starts talking about, quote, being more aggressive with Russia, that's the sort of sentence that should make everybody sit up. You see, right now, two things are happening simultaneously, and at first they don't quite seem to fit together either. On the one hand, NATO insists that this defensive alliance is bound by law, ethics, political caution. It does not escalate, and it does not preempt. However, NATO leaders are suddenly floating ideas like what's known as preemptive cyber action, more assertive maritime posture, and becoming proactive instead of reactive in response to Russian hybrid activity, the provocations we've seen in Eastern Europe, and now Britain. So which NATO is this? The cautious alliance terrified of escalation, or one that is being pushed towards a far more assertive posture because of Putin's actions? You see, once you line up the details here, the contradictions dissolve and what emerges is a much sharper truth. Russia's low-cost hybrid pressure, which it can do pretty easily, is forcing NATO into territory it never thought it would have to enter, and it's not entirely quite sure how to do so. So in this video, I wanted to break down what these latest set of NATO comments mean, discussing these sort of aggressive actions, the debate around inertia versus some kind of action, and why those on either side argue that NATO is pushing the world towards World War III, but at the same time, others say it's not doing enough to stand up against Putin. This is the Global Gambit. How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to the Global Gambit, where if you're new here, we focus on the intersection of geopolitics, international relations, economic statecraft, and as always, day on, day in, we are focusing on the Ukraine-Russia war because of the escalations and severity around it and understanding the structural forces shaping not just the conflict, but global affairs. Less noise, more substance here, because the topic is a major shift in the eyes of people, and one that hasn't received nearly enough attention in the longer discussion of the war, you can argue. Serious discussions about moving from reactive defense to proactive deterrence, something that many people feel is still enough to do because it would dissuade Putin from escalating, as we often cover. But that is my question for you on this. How far can NATO push? How far should it remain more about deterrence before it pushes the boundaries that might provocate the Russians? Or you never think that that would be the reality because of Russia's multiple red lines that have never been followed through on? Let me know in the comments below, because we revisit this topic, but when comments like these are made, including also France's about voluntary conscription, it shows you a big shift is happening. Now, as many of you will know, the historical context since the summer has been that Europe has been hit more than ever in recent memory by waves of hybrid warfare. Cable cutting in the Baltic Sea, cyber attacks across governments, drones probing eastern NATO airspace, and the Dark Sea Fleet activities. Some of these are undeniably traceable to Moscow, but some stay in the realm of that classically useful and favorited plausible deniability, something that the Iranians, the Russians, the North Koreans. And from Moscow's perspective, hybrid tactics are perfect. They're deniable, they're asymmetric, but most of all, they are cheap. They cost Russia a fraction, but impose huge costs, not purely materialistically or financially, but psychologically and politically on Europe states. You see, for NATO, this is the inverse. If they can't focus on the Ukraine, but also on themselves, it divides attention. With Admiral Giuseppe Dragono, NATO's top military officer, saying, being unusually candid in that NATO has legal constraints, ethical considerations, democratic oversight, and the need for alliance-wide consensus. So his emphasis is that one side has these rules and the other treats them as optional, and why Putin's war in Ukraine is so significant and why it redefines the modern order in many ways. So that contradiction is the heart of NATO's dilemma now. You are trying to deter a player who isn't playing by the same rules. They're playing an entire different game completely. So when Dragoni has told others that NATO is now studying to be more aggressive or shifting from reactive to proactive, especially in cyber posturing, he isn't freelancing. And in my opinion, I think it is something that we do need to do. He has been voicing a debate that's been growing amongst many of us on this channel or people that we engage with, especially amongst the Eastern European flank. The argument is, of course, simple. If they only ever react after a damage and a move is done, then you simply open the door to more. Cyberspace, especially where many NATO states already have offensive capabilities, is somewhere that they could have a comparative advantage, with the emerging question being whether to use them first in certain conditions can be framed as defensive, preventing an attack before it lands. Dragone has suggested that a preemptive strike could count as defensive action if it prevents something far worse, more escalatory. Of course, he and many others acknowledges its culture and politically far outside NATO's comfort zone. Unsurprisingly, Moscow has reacted with condemnation, and the foreign ministry calling the remarks irresponsible and framing them as evidence that NATO is a expansionist and aggressive power who's preparing for further escalation. Narrative warfare at its finest and a crucial part of any battlefield. But you can argue others do things from a preemptive standpoint. Israel and the situation in the Middle East has been something we've seen happen in the case of Iran. You can go back to a couple of videos I've discussed about Israel's approach to military doctrine and the idea of preemptive strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities as a way to deter or simply prevent an existential threat on Israel. Engagement in Gaza, but in this specific context, the idea of preemptive action is a military concept and something that has been used in various historical occasions to demonstrate value. Strategic deterrence is an important component of any broader grand strategy, be that of a nation state or a military alliance like NATO. The biggest question here is, of course, about the escalation ladder and whether or not it would push Putin over the edge. Now, many people would say that it won't, but that's the problem with nuclear weapons, which is what this conversation will gradually begin to include. So this is why it's the case of how far can you go? Because once you go that far, how easy is it to claw back and ensure that that de-escalation is still possible? Moreover, one area where NATO's more assertive posture seems to have worked is what's known as the Baltic Sentry mission. After repeated cable-cutting incidents in 23 and 24, often involving vessels linked to Russia's Shadow Fleet, NATO has increased its aerial, naval and drone patrols in the Baltic Sea. So Dragoni points to a striking fact. Since the Baltic Sentry began, no cables have been cut, and deterrence by presence, as it's known, seems to work as well. But the legal terrain is also where it's incredibly messy. In one instance, a Finnish case against the Shadow Fleet vessel suspected of sabotage was dismissed because the ship was in international waters, and providing intent is legally complex. So when asked whether this gives Russian vessels a form of immunity, Finland's foreign ministry has basically said yes, and that's the problem. You see, the crux is that NATO can patrol and shadow, as we've seen British vessels doing now with the Yantar in British waters last couple of weeks, but its legal system struggled to prosecute grey zone activities, precisely why I think we need a heavy modernisation of international humanitarian law or law of armed conflict. It's also partly why the conversation about being more aggressive is emerging. The threat has evolved faster than the law, and NATO, despite being the most complex and advanced in many ways military security alliance, is behind the times of what independent nation states can do. But if you find this kind of conversation and emphasis on deeper dives, then do consider subscribing. We're on the cusp of 100,000 subscribers, and I'd love to have you as part of that community as we enter 2026 and really try to break down what's going on here and the potential of an all-out confrontation, not just between NATO and Russia, but what it means for China and Taiwan, the United States, or even Trump's interests and issues with Venezuela. And of course, forgotten conflicts like Sudan or Myanmar. Then there's another layer to this story as well. It's one that I don't think has been fully appreciated yet. While NATO debates how to handle hybrid threats, Europe is quietly confronting a more existential question in itself. What happens if, and to a large extent when, the US simply isn't there in the way it used to be? A recent war game in Transylvania, Romania, offered a glimpse of that bleak future. A lush valley beneath the Carpathian Mountains, a natural border which has been crucial for history, for Napoleon or Russians seeing it as a natural border defense. A French-led, interestingly, European force conducted a full brigade-level exercise, defending NATO territory largely without the US. Caesar howitzers, Leclerc tanks, and French helicopters dominated the drills, with European troops filling almost every role. So this wasn't a symbolism for France, even though we've had the discussions around their role and its relationship to France's national pride. It's preparation of these scenarios. Because behind the scenes, the US has been actually reducing its military footprint across Europe. Troop levels in Romania cut from 17 to around 1,000. Withdrawals planned from Bulgaria, Slovakia, and Hungary. No surprises why those three. Clear signals that the US strategic focus is shifting even more permanently towards Asia. Washington insists these moves aren't abandonment, but European officials are very worried, and anyone who focuses on Europe and wishes the best for Europe, as we do here on the channel, Europe can no longer see things as dependent on the US's security umbrella. And that timing is brutal because, as we say, Russia's becoming much more shameless about its strikes, not just on Ukraine, but on its sabotage attempts across Europe, the Polish sabotage railway, and the intelligence assessments warning that Moscow could test NATO directly, not within the next decade, but 4 years before the end of the decade. So European governments know they need to step up. The coalition of the willing is very nice, but they're not ready yet. And these Transylvanian drills have said that they lack key strategic enablers like logistics primarily. The logistic challenges alone are the most revealing because French commanders complained it took 10 days to move their brigade to Romania, involving 5 planes, 11 trains, and 15 convoys. 3 days were lost purely to border bureaucracy, and that's the EU where there aren't supposed to be borders. So the EU is scrambling to cut red tape, speed up troop mobility, and build resilience, and why funds like the €150 billion SAFE programme are being created to rearm Europe, including 16 billion for Romania alone, who've only been part of the EU in the past 10 years. But officials are blunt. Europe cannot stand alone without rebuilding its industrial base. Buying from the US isn't enough, and that's why bigger countries like the French, Germans, British, you could argue, creating this E3, the core 3 more powerful states to push this. But this will, of course, all take years, and the uncomfortable truth, therefore, is this. Europe is being asked to do more, faster, simultaneously, whilst Russia is becoming more antagonistic or more provocative. And this couldn't be worse the timing. It gives no breathing space, and it's the geopolitical pressure cooker that shapes not just NATO's new debate, but specifically Europe's. And the management of NATO, even if there was an escalation with Russia, is difficult enough, let alone that the US is sort of distancing itself. The core structural problems being that Russia exploits that deniability in international waters, and that NATO, specifically Europe, has to defend itself according to legal precedent, alliance unity, which is not there, and democratic accountability, something that is being undermined by the more pro-Putin a few nations in, say, the forms of Hungary, Slovakia, and all bleeds into that reduction of military presence. NATO's leadership is caught between the two, trying to determine whether proactive defense can still fit inside the alliance's values and how much they need to modernize their approach to things, especially in the cybernetic realms and maritime actions, because of what seems to be behind the times, the law being behind the actions and operations. Basically, the old model of deterrence, clear red lines, clear retaliatory threats, is almost useless against hybrid tactics. And NATO, which has established itself on very conventional and predetermined forms of law of war, is behind it. Continuous air presence at sea, rapid attribution tools, resilience in cyber and infrastructure, covert responses when needed, and possibly these preemptive measures, framed as defense if used very specifically on, say, military targets, are all part of what could be a broader, complex strategy. And what deterrence looks like as Russia continues to probe for weakness is just that, potentially more weakness, inviting more engagement from Moscow. That asymmetry alone threatens to make permanent friction the new normal, and making the very cushy 30-plus years that Europe has gotten used to very much a thing of the past. And so the question here is how NATO adapts, whether it can or not. I put that question to you guys as we wrap up this video, and I say if you enjoyed it, then do consider subscribing, giving it a like. It's all free, it does help. And if you want to find more ways to support me, you can buy me coffee or a beer in the description below, and I'll see you all in the next one. Take care, everyone.